Please be seated. God is with us. God is with us. That can sound like such a cliche, and yet this understanding of reality is as essential to us as our breath. It's so fundamental that it's one of God's revealed names, Emmanuel. If we could really get this reality, if it could sink into the marrow of our bones and sneak into all the nooks and crannies of our hearts, we would be free. We would be free from the anxiety that grips us sometimes in the middle of the night. We would be free from despair over illness and limitations. We would be free from the power of death. We would still suffer, but we would be free. As Christians, we make a commitment to look at life through the lens of a particular story. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which means God is with us. This is at the very center, it's the very heart of our Christian story. Then why do we sometimes still feel so alone, and why do we sometimes feel full of doubt and anguish and confusion? Why does that sense of God with us seem very elusive at times? Maybe our main difficulty, our main source of bondage, is not our suffering, but a belief that we hold, a belief that our experience of life is somehow in contradiction to God with us. Perhaps our main source of bondage is that we limit how God can reveal Emmanuel. A young woman, pregnant but not by her husband, gave birth to a son who turned messianic expectations upside down and died a horrible death, tortured and crucified as a criminal. Her husband, a man more concerned about righteousness, more concerned about right relationship than shame or the letter of the law, courageous enough to follow the guidance of a dream. Neither Mary nor Joseph limited God. Both experienced Emmanuel. I worked for a while as a hospital chaplain, and I remember this one patient in particular. He was really angry about lots of things. And at some point in our conversation, he said, "I don't believe in God, and I don't believe in chaplains either." And I thought, and yet here we both are. But he really insisted that there's no way God could be present with him in the midst of his agony. And at some point in the conversation, I asked him, "How would you recognize God's presence?" He paused for a long time, and he finally said, "I don't know. I don't know." I loved the sincerity of his answer. He didn't give me maybe what I wanted to hear, like, "Oh, I recognize God's presence in the goodness of the people tending to me." But he also didn't give a realistic answer. "Oh, I'll recognize God's presence when I'm not suffering anymore." It was just so sincere. And it leads me to think, how do we recognize God's presence? Avery Dulles, who was a Jesuit priest, one of those Jesuits, wrote that Jesus enables us to believe that human life, with all of its contradictions, is the place where God is preeminently found. The incarnation, meaning God with us in the person of Jesus, the incarnation gives us strength to face up to the harsh realities of our fragmented world, to feel and transmit the touch of God's reconciling love. The incarnation does not provide us with a ladder by which to escape from the ambiguities of life and scale the heights of heaven. Rather, it enables us to burrow deep into the heart of the planet Earth and find it shimmering with divinity. It enables us to burrow deep into our lives exactly as they are and find them shimmering with divinity. I remember being with my friend Margie near her death. She was one of my adopted moms. I'd known her for decades, and she'd led a life for most of her life that looked a lot like a Hollywood movie. She had worked for the CIA as a spy in what was then the Soviet Union, and she'd had a fake spy husband and a fake spy travel agency business, and she had so many risky adventures, the stuff that movies are made of. But as her life went on, it began to look less and less like a Hollywood movie. She developed a very debilitating osteoporosis that just caused her spine to crumble. And she developed cancer in her lungs that spread throughout her entire body. She died a really difficult, painful death. And she also died a very holy death. The condition of her body forced her to become very quiet and very still. And that's something she never would have chosen for herself, but it's also something that she accepted, and in that chose to fully engage life in the ways that were available to her. I remember when she couldn't really eat any longer, and she'd ask for just a little drop of ice cream on the tip of her tongue. And she would delight in its flavors and just relish the coolness of it. She developed the ability to appreciate the most simple pleasures and to be just full of gratitude. When someone brought her flowers, she would sit and stare at those flowers for hours in awe of their beauty. She became acutely aware of beauty all around her. She had always loved life, but in this final part of her journey, she really came to experience it as shimmering with divinity. And in her, I came to experience death as shimmering with divinity. At the end of the Gospel of John, Jesus says to Peter, "I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." We're all eventually led to places we do not wish to go. We're led to places of illness, to places of profound limitation, to places of profound loss, and eventually to places of death. Our willingness to fully engage life as it is in those places will enable us to see life as shimmering with divinity. Our trust in Emmanuel to lead us safely through those places is the obedience of faith that Paul wrote about in our lessons from Romans. So that brings us back to the question, how do we recognize God's presence with us? We shed the false belief that there's any contradiction between our suffering and God with us. We shed the false belief that there's any contradiction between our suffering and God with us. We let go of a list of requirements, a list of what we demand as evidence of God with us. We watch for the goodness that comes to us, and then we choose to interpret it through the lens of our Christian story. We watch for the goodness that comes to us because it does come to us, and we choose to interpret it as evidence of Emmanuel. I want to close with a poem. It's called The Lake of Beauty, written by Edward Carpenter. It's a poem that's in the New Zealand prayer book. Let your mind be quiet, realizing the beauty of the world and the immense, the boundless treasures that it holds in store. All that you have within you, all that your heart desires, all that your nature so specially fits you for. That or the counterpart of it waits embedded for you in the great whole. It will surely come to you. Yet equally surely not one moment before its appointed time will it come. All your crying and fever and reaching out of hands will make no difference. Therefore, do not begin that game at all. Do not recklessly spill the waters of your mind in this direction and in that, lest you become like a spring lost and dissipated in the desert. But draw the waters of your mind together into a little compass and hold them still, and let them become so clear, so limpid, so mirror-like. At last the mountains and the sky shall glass themselves in peaceful beauty, and the antelope descend to drink and to gaze at her reflected image, and the lion to quench his thirst. And love himself shall come and bend over and catch his own likeness in you. And love himself shall come and bend over and catch his own likeness in you shimmering with divinity. God is with us. Amen.
Amen.